Folks, welcome. How are you? If I could have your attention, please. I have a attendance code for you. All right. The number is 8474. 8474. So while you're doing that, I want to tell you a couple of other housekeeping matters before we get started. As I said, the final project is going to go live on November 10th, which is this coming Thursday. That's the bad news. The good news is, from your perspective, I suspect, that on Thursday, November 17th, we will not have class. Sorry, I thought that was funny. Thursday, November 17th, we will not have class. So you are free to do whatever kind of chaos-inducing business you all are interested in. And then we'll resume classes again the following Monday. Any questions about where we are right now in the course? Okay, good. I am absolutely delighted that we have as our guest today one of America's most innovative restaurateurs, Roger Berkowitz, the CEO of Legal Seafoods. Roger started working in the family fish market in Inman Square, Cambridge at the age of 10 and held a variety of roles prior to becoming president and CEO in 1992. Since taking the helm, he's led the company's growth and diversification. He now oversees restaurant, retail, and mail order divisions and steers the course for 4,000 employees. Roger graduated from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University and attended executive education programs at Harvard Business School, University of London School of Business, and Stanford Graduate School of Business. He holds an honorary master's degree from the Culinary Institute of America and honorary doctorates from Johnson & Wales University, Newbury College, Salem State University, and Nichols College. Among numerous awards and recognition, Roger was named a James Beard Outstanding Restaurateur semifinalist, inducted into the Menu Masters Hall of Fame by the nation's restaurant news, and received the Chairman's Award for Distinguished Meritorious Service by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. Please join me in welcoming Roger Berkowitz.
Good. Thank you, George.
All right, I'll just sit here.
Great. So you didn't get my PowerPoint presentation, did you?
That's right. It's still in the kitchen.
I'm electronically uninclined, so you couldn't see one. Actually, we do have one, but it's usually for marketing and advertising. So I thought we'd get a little bit more broad today and talk about a little bit of the history of Legal Seafoods and some of the watershed moments that have changed us and informed us over time, and some of the things that we think about today. We go back to 1904. My grandfather, Harry, had a grocery store in Inman Square, Cambridge, called Legal Cash Market. He used to redeem something called Legal Cash stamps. They were the forerunners of the S&H green stamp. He had a really good reputation. He was focused on quality, never compromised on quality, always had to be the finest product. He focused on meats and produce, and that was sort of his hallmark right there. He operated that business from the early 1900s up to the mid-40s, and then lots of competition. New supermarkets were opening up, the Stop and Shops of the world, the A&Ps of the world, and he wasn't sure quite how he could compete. My father, George, and his brother, Leonard, were in school at the time, and they were asked to leave school and help in the family business. And when they got there, they had a cousin that worked for Stop and Shop. And the cousin said, hey, if you guys want to compete, you have to have some of the same niceties that supermarkets have. And one of the things they have are fish counters. So my father thought, okay, maybe I'll put up a fish counter in the grocery store. Now, the grocery store was actually 2,500 square feet. You could probably put 3 of them inside this space, so there wasn't an awful lot of room. And as such, he ended up leasing the adjacent storefront and putting the fish counter there. He had fresh fish, a little bit of a fried fish and chips takeout area, and he wanted to show the same family tie-in. So took the name Legal off of Cash Market and put it onto Seafoods. And so if you went to Inman Square, Cambridge in 1950, you would see legal cash market and legal seafoods. Now, the problem was, if you go back into the 50s, there's maybe, I might be the only person, George, maybe you, I don't know, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, but fish was not overly popular. You ate fish for one or two reasons. You were religious and had to eat fish on Fridays, or else it was something that was very inexpensive. And so those weren't the great reasons for eating seafood. So we sort of, went, had a tough time up to the mid-60s. And sometimes if you're in the right place at the right time, you get a little lucky. But that's only if you're sort of focused on fundamentals. And we were focused on the fundamentals of quality and guest service. And what happened was, there was a tremendous influx of Asians into the Boston-Cambridge market. And they were coming with their families on sabbatical, and they were studying things like computer sciences at Harvard and MIT. And they had really peculiar dietary habits. Much of what they consumed was fish, and a lot of it was raw fish. And I can remember being a 10-year-old kid behind the fish counter, and someone pointing to different cuts of fish in the case, and I would wrap it up and I would give it to them. And all of a sudden they'd open up the package and start to eat it raw. Now, today we said, well, that's sushi or that's sashimi. But back then it was something that was pretty odd. And then all of a sudden a lot of doctors and nutritionists started to take a look at the Asian diet and say, longer incidence of longer lifespan, lower incidence of cancer rates, and lower incidence of heart disease. It might have something to do with the diet. And so that's how sort of the renaissance of seafood, particularly in this region, started to take hold. Again, sometimes you're in the right place at the right time. A woman moved into the neighborhood. She started buying fish from us for herself, and then she started putting it on her new cooking show on the PBS network, and that was Julia Childs. And she started showing people that seafood could indeed taste good in addition to being nutritious. And so again, another sort of reason, another sort of foundation of how the fish business sort of achieved a bit of a renaissance. And the third thing that happened is that we were so close to the pier, we had great access to quality product. So the confluence of all those things coming together was sort of the impetus in legal sort of taking hold a little bit. Now, if we fast forward a little bit ahead into the 1980s, we had 4 or 5 restaurants at that point. I was thinking of doing some different kinds of restaurants, and I had an opportunity to go back to school. And this was a program designed for people who had been out of school for about 10 years and trying to figure out how to grow their businesses. And the guy who ran the program was a really tough guy, a really tough professor. And he sort of liked to have fun with his students in a way that was sort of akin to torturing them. And you would rotate the classes around, so every couple of weeks there was always someone new sitting in the front row. And I had watched him essentially cut off the legs of a number of people. And so I did what any other student would do who does not want to get called on, is that you look away. You do not have any eye contact. And so I was looking away. And he knew what I was doing. And he went over to me, he goes, "Berkowitz." And I'm thinking to myself, man, he's going to crucify me. And I can't give him a smart-ass answer. I just got to. So I go, "Yes." And he said, "What business are you in?" So my mind is racing. I don't want to give him a smart-ass answer. So I don't want to be glib. I say, "I'm in the restaurant business." He goes, "Oh, you think so, huh?" I'm thinking, I can't believe I blew that answer. So he says, "You're going to do an environmental analysis of your business, and you're going to hand it in next term." And I'm the only one. We lived on campus 3 weeks a year for 3 successive years. And I'm the only one that gets this assignment of doing an environmental analysis. So I do the work and I do the paper and I hand it in. And he does, the next semester, I give it to him. He waves it in front of my face, waves it in front of the class. He goes, all right, Berkowitz, what business are you in now? So I said, I'm in the fish business. He said, oh, good, you did your homework. And the single most important lesson I ever learned, in that his message was, yes, you've done a lot of things in restaurants, and that might have been a vehicle, but really where you had sort of the focus and the impetus is something that you need to continue to develop. And from that lesson back in the mid-'80s to today, that has been sort of the absolute focus of what we do. Everything we do has to be seafood-centric. Now, you've seen us certainly in restaurants and whatnot, but we're also in different channels. We have a mail order channel, we have a retail channel, but it is all seafood-focused. All right, so that's sort of the business that we're in. Now, it's interesting, you know, growing up, how many of you remember a business? It could be a dry cleaner, it could be a supermarket, it could be a restaurant, you know, an ice cream shop that's not there anymore. Right? You know, I think we all do. And we think, gee, it was so good. What happened to it? Why isn't it there anymore? And it wasn't that the owners one day woke up and said, ooh, let's have some bad merchandise. Let's have some bad hospitality. What happened? What happens is things change. And you have to be plugged into change all the time, or else you become obsolete. Back in the right before the recession, I started to think about some of the rumblings that was happening in my business. You know, we have a clientele, and I was watching one of our restaurants in particular, our Chestnut Hill restaurant. And I was noticing that the customers in that restaurant were demonstrating a very bad habit. You know what they were doing? They were dying. We had a lot of seniors. We had some aging boomers. And I'm thinking, this is really not a terrific business model if your guests are dying off on you. So I thought, okay, we've got to do something. We've got to engage. We've got to bring on we've got to engage with the next generation, which is Gen X, Y, and certainly the millennial. How to do that, what to do, what to think about. And I had started something called the President's Advisory Council. Now what that is I took 2 hourly employees out of every restaurant. They had to be hourly, could not be management. Because the hourly employees, the host staff, the wait staff, the bar staff, the cooks, they were the ones that were closest to the guest, closest to the customer. And I put them in a room, and I started asking, I did not have any other management there. I just started asking them questions in terms of what it is they saw. And I had one question, as an example, that management couldn't solve. And it seemed, you know, very simple. Why couldn't we solve it? And the issue was, we had an item on the menu. It was baked stuffed shrimp, one of the most popular items on the menu, except we also got the most number of complaints on that. Some people thought it should have been sweeter, the stuffing. Some people thought it should have been more savory. It went back and forth. I brought in consultants. I brought in chefs. We kept changing the recipe every 6 months. Could not figure this out. So I just threw it over to this group. And I said, all right, we have an issue with the baked stuffed shrimp. How are we gonna solve this issue? And so a hand rose on the back, and it was a guy named Bill Maloney, who was a bartender for us. He said, you know, you do the crab cakes. Crab cakes tend to be very popular. Why don't you do a variation of that and put that on the shrimp? And I'm looking at him, thinking it can't be that easy. And I went to our chef, and I went to Rich, and I said, you know, Rich, what about this? And he gave me that same dumbfounded look that I had had. And we didn't think it could be that easy, but of course it was. And we did it. And so the point of this is that oftentimes people closest to the guest have the most information, no one ever asked them their opinion. You know, the same group I had, and I said, you know, we have in the suburbs, some people don't think our menu is very family friendly to kids. How are we going to change that? You guys have any ideas? And of course they did have ideas. And not only were the ideas good, but within a relatively short period of time, we won an award for the Family Restaurant of the Year, and were featured in magazines and included on CBS Morning News. So if I had given that same task or asked the same task to our management group, I can assure you we would not have achieved the same results. So it was thinking about some of the things that we had done. I sort of took this group, and I wanted to open a different kind of restaurant, a restaurant that appealed more to millennials, 20 and 30 somethings, as opposed to, you know, aging boomers and seniors. And so I sat down with a group of them, and I had some preconceived notions. I said, hey, you know, we want to have big portions, right? And they're kind of looking at me like I have two heads. And I said, you know, we're not really interested in big portions. We really want smaller portions, more varied in flavor, and in smaller dishes. So essentially what I was hearing is sort of the tapas style. And again, left to my own devices at that point, I'm not sure I would have heard that or certainly come to those conclusions on my own. So, okay. And I said, you know, we want big drinks, right? Everyone wants big drinks. And so the response I got is, no, not necessarily big drinks. We actually want, you know, perhaps a little smaller, better crafted, and at a better price point, because we're there to socialize. We really want a different experience. And so it was taking that information and then putting that into a business plan, and we opened the LTK, which is down in the Seaport District in Boston, that sort of hit upon that. And the interesting thing is we did hit a lot of the 20 and 30-somethings. That really became sort of the bulk of our guest base there. But we also got older groups. We got 40, 50, and 60-year-old somethings that want to be in the company of the 20 and 30-year-old somethings. So change was afoot. People were sort of talking about it, but sometimes you have to reach out to get the information you need. If I was going to do a focus group, I can guarantee you I would not have come to the same kinds of conclusions. Now, what has been happening over time? There's two economists at MIT that came out with a book a couple of years ago called The Second Revolution. I may have gotten the title wrong, but they took a look, the second machine age, and they took a look at the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s and said, okay, this is machine age number one. The second machine age, they said, it actually became the digital era that started in the early 80s, I think with the first desktop computer. It didn't really go anywhere at that point, but it showed that it was a start. But over the course of the last 10 years, think about all the changes in the digital economy in terms of what is happening. It has fast forward. You know, it used to be flip phones. Now it's everyone has a smartphone. There was no such thing as laptops per se. All of a sudden, I'm looking around, everyone here has a laptop or an iPad. Things like Uber didn't exist 7 years ago. Lyft didn't exist 7 years ago. Think of all the transformation and game-changing things that are taking place right now. I mean, it's this huge, huge change. How many people here buy the majority of their items outside of food online? You know, if I had asked this 7 years ago, 2 or 3 hands might have popped up. That's part of what's taking place. There is a huge change, a huge revolution, if you will, of how things are being done. And so those of us who are in business have to take a look at business models because the things are happening fast and furiously. So how do we think about stuff? You know, there's a lot of legislation that's being passed these days. You've heard about minimum wage going up, $13, $14, $15. You hear about the Family Leave Act. You hear about sick days. And it's one thing for minimum wage going up, it sort of compresses everything. How many labor-intensive businesses are going to successfully be able to absorb those and stay in business? I'm going to say probably not a lot. You're going to see some radical changes after the first of the year. You're starting to see some changes now. You've seen Macy's close 100 stores nationally. I think that's the tip of the iceberg. There's no question that online has taken some of that business away. And you could certainly argue there are too many bricks and mortar stores out there. So you're going to see that change taking place. And your generation looks at things radically differently than aging boomers and seniors. In fact, the demographics have changed to the point where probably 55 to 60% of the US population is now millennials. You think, you act, you do differently. And what it means is older models, whether it be in the restaurant business, whether it be in the car business, whether it be in education, is going to go through some radical changes. And so those of us who have been around and are watching this have to be proactive in terms of what's happening. Now, how many people have ever heard of lean? L-E-A-N. Okay. So lean actually had its roots in the United States back in World War II, and it was developed to be put to work in factories, and it was a more efficient way of doing things. And when the men went off to war, women took over the plants, and in order to get the women up to speed, they had to have a methodology, a management skill, and a business program that became more efficient because they did not have the time to lag if they were going to support the war effort. Anyway, the war is over. The men come back to take over the factory jobs. It's business as usual. The U.S. is then charged with rebuilding Japan, and they export lean over to Japan. A funny thing happens when it's over there. A lot of companies there embrace lean, and they really get it. And so what happens is, there was, and sort of fast forward, in the 70s, there was a professor or a researcher at MIT by the name of Womack, Jim Womack. And he started studying the automotive industry. And he discovered that when he looked at Japan, Germany, Italy, the United States, all the major car manufacturers, that one car company was literally blowing the doors off of everyone else, and that was Toyota. They could manufacture quality product, a higher quality product, faster and at a better value than anyone else in the world. So he started talking and writing about lean. He wrote a book called The Company That Changed the World. I think that was published in the 80s or the 90s. And lean sort of became something that he was focused on, talked about. And essentially what lean does is it takes a look at business, it takes a look at for-profits, nonprofits, educational institutions, government, and it says, look, as businesses or institutions grow, they tend to add a level of bureaucracy on. And the level of bureaucracy does not add any value. It simply is another way of looking at things through a different lens. And his philosophy, and the philosophy of lean, is get rid of any level of bureaucracy that does not add value to the guest, client, customer experience. And so I had heard about this, and I was kind of intrigued by it. And I had a friend that was running one of the hospitals in Boston who wrote a book and was talking about how he brought a group into his hospital to take a look at what he was doing. And he had an oncology unit. And the oncology unit was losing money, poor morale amongst the doctors, and the patients, in as much as they had cancer, did not like going there because it was over a 3-hour ordeal. He brought in a group. Within a short period of time, the unit is making money, high morale amongst the doctors, and the patient's experience is down to about an hour or less. So I asked him, I said, who is this group? And he introduced this fellow, Jim Womack, to me. And long story short, after 3-4 meetings, Jim decided that he'd work with us, but he wanted to try an experiment first. He always wanted to do a project, joint project with the Toyota folks, because the Toyota folks have their own division that does lean, and they sometimes like to work with American companies. It was a way, when they started manufacturing over here, it was sort of a way of engendering sort of an olive branch. And so they had their department, and so Jim and the Toyota folks agreed to come to our fish plant and to take a look to see if they can improve anything. So they took a look at the fish plant where we cut gray sole. Now, gray sole is kind of a difficult fish to process. It has a little bit of an enzyme on it. It's hard to skin. It has bones. But it's delicious fish, it's time consuming. So they studied us. It always took us 214 minutes to cut X amount of gray sole, handling the fish 3 times. 214 minutes handling the fish 3 times. At the end of their observations, they say, we have a few suggestions. Let's reposition some of the equipment, and let's reposition some of the people. It went from 214 minutes handling the fish 3 times to 28 minutes handling it once. I didn't know whether to be ecstatic or embarrassed. I mean, this was crazy stuff. But they kept going through the plant, and what it showed us is that the work environment has to rely on continual improvement to get the results. And if you take out the bureaucracy, the accounting, if you will, and focus on improving the process, you can improve anything. So we've been doing this for about 2.5 years in our plant. We have just put it out into the restaurants. The restaurant model has never been changed since its inception. Whether it was for me or someone else, it's the same model. So they're applying some of the lean principles. How do you do it better, faster, more value to the guest? And so that's one of the things that we have really gone in on full board over the past couple of years. Certainly more difficult doing it in restaurants than manufacturing. Manufacturing tends to be easier, but the same principles apply. And in an environment where if I sat back and I said, okay, we're in the restaurant business, hey, this is the way we've been doing it, and more costs are coming on, that's not a sustainable model. You cannot do it that way. You have got to be thinking differently. And so that's what we do today. We're in the midst of really putting a lean mentality. And it's not something that you put in place for 6 months or a year. It's something that you put in place. It's ongoing. It's like a religion. Once you start, you do not stop. So that's going to continue to happen. Other things that we look at that we've learned through lean is that we're doing smaller restaurants these days and trying to change around the menu. We'll never change the DNA of what we're doing, but we will have different models. How many people like cars, right? How many people like BMWs or Audis or Mercedes? They're great cars, right? When all those car companies came to the U.S., they had one model. And off of that one model, they established the DNA of the company. But now, if you look, BMW has a zillion different models, whether it's an SUV, whether it's a smaller one to the luxury ones. Same thing with Audi and Mercedes. They all do that. And so that's sort of what we think about. We think about how do we take the DNA of what we do and make sure that it's available to people, whether we call it the C-Bar, whether we call it LX, whether we call it the Oysteria, whether we call it the Harborside, give people enough choice to have it on their terms. That's something that we're hearing and paying very close attention to. So that's kind of the things that we think about on a going forward basis. The world changes, and if you are going to change, if you are going to survive, if you are going to establish a business, you have to be paying attention at all times. You cannot be complacent. You can't think, well, gee, this model worked 5 years ago. It's not going to work today. So I'm going to leave you with that, and I'm happy to sit down and answer some questions. Thank you.
Well, Roger, this is exactly what I'd hoped that we'd have as sort of base material to talk about. The whole idea that things change is exactly what sort of design thinking is about. Your flavor can be lean, but it's a strategy for adapting to and even predicting some of the future. Let me just start with, one of the reasons I wanted to have you is I enjoyed meeting you a couple of years ago, and I've always been impressed with Legal Seafoods restaurants, like many of your customers. No matter where they are, no matter what model they are, the quality seems always super high, and I know, because when you think about it, how hard that must be to do. I want to have occasionally restaurateurs on, because making that work, making it seem seamless to the customer, there's a lot behind that. Without an entire business model, maybe you can just explain to me, like, how do you train people? You have all these you have all these employees. How do you train people to make sure that experience is the one you want them to have?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think that we were criticized a lot early on because we did something that restaurants generally don't do. Certainly, if you have one restaurant, you don't really do it, but if you have two or three, and that's we established a commissary where we could control the temperature of the product. Because one of the things about seafood is that if you do not keep it under constant refrigeration, regardless of how fresh it is, it can go bad on you. So we have a plant in South Boston. It used to be in Allston. We moved to South Boston. And the temperature is always, appropriately cold. And so the fish is cut under ideal situations. It's handled by the same people. And then we took certain recipes like the chowder. And we had, when we had 3 restaurants, everyone had the chowder recipe. But yet you could go to one restaurant and it would taste radically different than the other 2. So we wanted to make a consistent scenario out of it. So we thought initially that, by having a commissary, we would save money. That was not the case. It actually cost us more money. But we ended up with a very consistent product. And we do our training out of there, and it's all about consistency and not to give you a, just sort of a bland experience, but how do you absorb the DNA of what we're trying to teach? And I think that sometimes having a central location like that, it makes it a little bit easier.
Well, this gets to a question I've been wanting to ask you for a while, and that is, so we had Joanne Chang and Christopher Myers as our other restaurateur guests this time around, and they were great. They have their one-off restaurant, which is called Myers and Chang in the South End, and then they now have 4 bakeries called Flour, but they're about to expand to 8. And so my question to them was, so are you're going to use the same designers for all 8, because maybe 8 will become 16 and 32? No, we think we want to keep it at 8. And I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. There's a fundamental distinction in design, in business, that I think is really interesting. It's like the distinction between haute couture on the one hand, things that are done one at a time, and pret-a-porter, or ready-to-wear, which is taking it to scale. Completely different, right? You can have the customized jacket, or we can take what we like of that customized jacket and make 8,000 of them in every possible size. Right. You know where I'm going. I've heard you multiple times say, I want to be very clear, Legal Seafood is not a chain.
Right.
Now, you have 34 restaurants.
Yes.
You exist at airports.
Yes.
At some point, it's getting awfully close to meeting the criteria of a chain, but you've got to tell me why it's not one.
So when you think of chain, I mean, the first things that sort of come to mind are cookie cutter, dummied down, institutionalized. Not things that make you sort of warm and fuzzy. Right. So I think that what we do in these cases is really, what is the DNA? Well, the DNA certainly is the quality of what we do. I mean, whether you get the fish in a C-bar, or you get it in a Harborside, or you get it in a traditional legal, the DNA of that product is going to be the same. We can change the recipe. We can, sort of, if the second floor Harborside, we can bring in abalone, which on a wholesale basis costs us, I think, $1,000 a pound.
Wow.
So, but it's not applicable to all the restaurants, but in certain settings it is. So you take the same mentality, and how do you broaden it out? Now, it's interesting, because I had the same discussion with a clothing designer, because you brought up clothing as an idea, who's from Boston originally, Joseph Abboud.
Oh, I've been trying to get him as a guest for this exact same reason.
Okay. Well, if you get him, I won't give away his secret, but he does. He's in the Men's Warehouse. He's in Joseph A. Banks, but he also has a flagship store in Manhattan. And the way he does it, I mean, he takes the same DNA, but the flagship store is going to have a higher quality cloth to it than might be for his other price points. And so, at a certain point, you want to be able to take your brand and spread it through as many different channels, I think, as possible. So, again, I look at restaurants certainly as being one. I look at retail.
Right.
How do we get into certain retail channels? We have our chowder route in retail channels right now. And then, what is the future going to hold? Right. Because it is radically different in terms, when you think of, and there's a huge 800-pound gorilla out there, that when it comes to delivery, they're going to own delivery. And so,
You're talking about Amazon.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And so the question is, how do you fit into that? And part of it has to do with, what are you folks going to be looking for? Right. And then how do we fit in? We can no longer say, oh, this is what we do. You're going to, take it or not, because you're going to have too many choices out there. So we have to take what it is, the essence of what we do best, and fit it into channels that are going to be appealing.
Well, this is really interesting, and I'm just thinking this thought right now as I'm tying together a couple of questions. But it could be that your specialized, customized restaurant experiences, and they're not an endless number right now. It's 34 is a manageable number to have control of the experience in them. And I want to talk about if you work with experienced designers who call themselves that. But I was going to ask a question about Blue Apron, plated, fresh, oven fresh, or whatever it is, open fresh. As maybe these are scalable channels that where you don't have to make the decision about taking the physical restaurant into the ready-to-wear market, because you've got the online one. I mean, yes. I can already get legal chowder, I believe, at Costco.
You can,
yeah,
absolutely.
And so the idea that might then participate in a scalable marketplace then suddenly makes more sense to me. The reason for the sort of humor in the question was, like, at some point, if you're going to keep growing, the restaurant thing, whether you call it a chain or not, is going to be indistinguishable from what everyone else calls a chain.
Right.
If it got to be 200 stores or 300 stores.
Well, again, so that's where design actually plays a role, because I don't want everything to look alike. And I also want to go into locations that are different. I want to go into high traffic locations. Doesn't mean that what used to be a 7,500 square foot model is the model I look for. And the airport actually taught me that I can do a 600 square foot model, or a 1,200 square foot model, or an 1,800 square foot model. And we've learned to adapt. So it's not, we must have these things, because you're in an adaptable world. And the only thing that I want is I want to be near the people. I want to be near where the traffic is in terms of doing it. And so in thinking about it that way, I'm not going to be offered the perfect site or what is easy for me to do. I have to be able to adapt to the site that's available. And that's a challenge I don't mind taking on.
It's interesting. I don't know if this will occur to everybody here, but that's why chains exist primarily in the suburbs, because they can control the exact footprint. If a Texas Roadhouse or a Wendy's, they have maybe 4 store types or 3 across their 3,000 locations. And if they were trying to exist primarily in high traffic areas, they do exist in cities, of course. But if they were trying to exist primarily in those places, it'd be a totally different thing where they would have to be much more adaptable.
Absolutely.
So
it's also more fun. I mean, it forces us to be creative in terms and challenges us. How are we going to do it? And sometimes, when the first time I was shown a smaller version of a restaurant operation in an airport. I think it was 1,600 square feet. It was U.S. Air at Logan. And our folks said, there's no way we can put a restaurant in here. And so we took it upon as a personal challenge. And son of a gun, we figured out that we could do it. So I think that, that's what adaptation is all about. If you see an opportunity, don't be so rigid in your thinking that you don't believe that you can change it.
Right. Well, we already delved into to this whole new. I mean, the models that are taking over in the sort of digital revolution that you mentioned, the models that are taking over in food delivery from literally 8 competing food delivery web services here, from Grubhub to. I'm signed up for another one called Caviar. I don't even really know how they're different. I like to try them just to test it out. And then the meal preparation services, which is another game-changing thing, it seems to me.
I mean, it's fascinating. So if, and I may be going out on a limb here, and I may be radically wrong, but when I see the Blue Apron, I think, okay, Blue Apron is interesting. What I've read about the model there is that people get bored with it in about a month. And so the idea is, how do you keep more, it's almost like a Ponzi scheme, how do you keep more people adding on than they're dropping off? Right. So I think that what I've learned thus far from millennials is that it is about convenience and smart usage of time. And while a Blue Apron is interesting for a hobbyist, if you will, if you have a 2-income family and you have kids and whatnot, time is of the essence. You want maybe the flavor of eating out. You may want maybe the assemblage aspect, but you don't want to be dicing onions.
Right. I'm still in my first month with Blue Apron.
Okay.
And I don't know. It's
so
pretty
all right. So let's say 3 months out. Now you're getting this, because it's going to change your lifestyle in terms of what you've traditionally been doing.
Right.
So I think that my gut is you'll call them and say, hey, can you delay this one another week? And
well, that's what I read the same things you have, that this is very popular at the beginning because people, it is meeting a perceived need on the part of the client, the customer, which is, well, I like convenience. I like the no waste aspect, especially a young person or a person who travels a fair amount. I like that I can stop it a week and restart again the next week. And I like the pleasure of cooking, but not too much, like under an hour, and it's pretty close to restaurant quality, I would say, actually, despite my being the chef. I have to tell you, that means they've got their act together. But it's just that the menu's going to have to be like, it's going to have to be maybe more adaptive than it looks like it is to start with. In other words, if it does start using, Amazon-type algorithms that if you like this, then you'll like this, the way they do with Spotify and everything else, I wouldn't be surprised if it could work. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if restaurant businesses that got started in the restaurants, Illegal Seafoods or someone else, doesn't start to see, oh, we could definitely do this. Or we could pair with somebody else. And because I think it is, at least superficially, I think it is taking out, if there's one pie, it's taking out of the restaurant eating, at least for me. And I think it would be for a lot of people. It also is taking out of the time grocery shopping, dramatically changes grocery shopping. Of course, if Amazon's going to just make that so instantaneously simple anyway, maybe that's not such a convenience.
I mean, if you think about it and think about what they've been doing, all the groundwork that they have been laying out there's a lot of people that have made inroads, I think, but there's no one that has the capacity to dominate the way that they do. So it's once they decide what and how they're going to do it, I think it's game over in a lot of scenarios.
I've read, and I don't know this, I've read that they're planning to, roll out like 3,000 locations. That's just mind-blowing to me. But that would change.
Their idea, and speaking to some folks over there, their idea is that anything you want should be available to you in under an hour.
Right.
I mean, that's game-changing stuff.
Yeah. Well, if you combine that with what our recent guest, Robin Chase, is talking about in terms of autonomous vehicles, we see a networked, at least city, and it would happen in cities first because it makes more sense.
Sure.
But wow, I mean, that really would alter everything, which leads me to something that we were talking about outside before we sat down in here, and a point I don't think we can overstate in this class. This isn't a sociology class. It's not a demographics class, but the social and economic transformation that is going to happen as a result of all these changes is just overwhelming. You're talking about how difficult it is for restaurants in the current model, and I've heard this from other restaurateurs, that the cost of labor, people don't understand. It's a very labor-intensive business, and this really is a big slice of the pie. I've heard, at least in small-time restaurants, a third of the pie is labor.
Oh, absolutely.
And
yes.
Anyway.
So one of the things that's going to happen is that people are going to try to figure out how to get labor out, whether it's through a lean methodology. In Asia, as an example, it's happening in Taiwan, it's happening in Japan, and it's happening in Singapore. A lot of restaurants are experimenting now with robots and on repetitive kinds of things. So whether it's on the prepping of product or the delivery of product. So you're going to see more of that happen, for the new restaurants and restaurants that are really trying to adapt.
This is less a design thinking kind of question, but because you have your finger on the pulse of the restaurant world, you've been in business the entire time I've been in Boston. I came here in 1986 to the Boston area when Boston was a restaurant backwater, most people would say, compared to New York or San Francisco. And it is now a veritable embarrassment of riches. There are so many good restaurants in this area. But I wonder if we're reaching, even though we're growing in population and in wealth, the disparity in wealth is growing, but the number of people who can afford to eat out is definitely higher than it was 10 years ago. But it does seem that, do you think we're getting close to a saturation on?
I think we're oversaturation. I think that there's at least a 10 or 15%. I'm not sure in Boston, probably in Boston, but I know nationally there's a 10 or 15% oversaturation, overcapacity of restaurant seats for those that can afford to eat out. And I've also said there's also, restaurateurs are not the smartest group of people in that regardless of the economy, they keep opening. I think that it will be less forgiving in the course of the next year or so as some of the legislation actually and the impact of that legislation takes effect.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things we just are not reading enough about is certainly I've heard this not just from you, from others who are in labor-intensive businesses. Wait a second, we can all applaud a $15 an hour minimum wage, but let's be clear that we understand the consequences of some of these things.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
But the consequences of, let's say, depopulation of low-end labor, which is already, there's not enough of employment opportunities in those areas. This is a complicated jigsaw puzzle.
It is a very complicated jigsaw puzzle, and certainly there are those that start out at lower wages in the restaurant business that if they do well certainly get promoted, and the fact that they have sort of this breadth of experience makes them makes the talent pool very attractive.
Better managers if they know what
absolutely. Absolutely, but so what happens, so over the short term, the unintended consequences is of not just going up pretty significantly on minimum wage, but that compresses all the other wages in the restaurant business at the same time. And, for the first time, we're hearing people will call in sick, and it has to do, and I've been speaking with other restaurateurs, they've never seen anything like it because, certainly like on a Saturday night, key time, it's all hands on deck.
Right.
For the first time, people are experiencing, people are calling up and saying, you know what, I can't come in tonight, and they're calling in on a Saturday night when they're needed, and it's because legislation has been passed for 6 days, and they don't see anything wrong with it.
Right.
And it's sort of like an entitled kind of thing. And so that's going to change restaurant dynamics. And unfortunately, I think it's going to force, that mentality is going to force some restaurants out of the spectrum.
Well, I think I don't doubt that at all. You know better than I do. I will say I'm sure that innovative managers will rise to the occasion, just like innovative managers do in any changing context.
There's no question there will be some innovation, but I think also, so if this legislation was passed, and again, sometimes legislatures do things, they have actually no idea of the ramifications of
That
it.
I'm certain of.
So, and so what you're going to find is, okay, fine, all these laws are going into effect, and unemployment's been pretty good, but all of a sudden, unemployment's going to take a huge spike. And so the unintended consequences, people who had decent jobs are all of a sudden not going to have the same job.
Well, and what we're both saying is there's going to be multiple engines for this, for potential rise in unemployment. One is regulatory, the other is technological.
Yes.
And who knows which one is going to be the greater driver. They're both going to be powerful, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is something that is, again, we need to design for. This is
Yes, right, because if you take an old traditional model, it's not sustainable anymore.
It isn't. I totally agree. So let me ask you. This is a little less rigorous a question, I suppose. But as someone who's been in this for a long time, what are your favorite restaurant experiences?
Excuse me.
Not necessarily your favorite restaurant, but I alluded to experience
Okay.
design before, and what are some that you really admire?
So
or
my
enjoy?
favorite restaurant experiences, and we design a bit this way, is bar experiences. My wife and I love going to restaurants, certainly. We like sitting at the bar. We find the bar more interactive. We find that the bartender / server is sort of more accessible. We find we get more information, more attention. If there's someone to the left or the right of us, sometimes it's more engaging. So when we design restaurants these days, we're becoming much more bar-centric. Also, where it works out well is that restaurants in the past were not particularly inviting to single diners because, if you went in, there was a small bar area, and it wasn't conducive to sitting and eating at the bar. You really didn't want to go and sit at a table because the table was either for 2 or 4, and you didn't want to feel out of place in that regard. But what bars do, they sort of create a safety net, if you will, where you can come in and people aren't expecting you to get a full meal. You might want a glass of wine, you might want an appetizer, you may not want any alcohol, you may want just a cup of chowder and soda water, whatever it happens to be. But I think that gives an umbrella for people to coming in, getting whatever they want, whenever they want. Also, from a time standpoint, it sort of breaches the shoulder time. It might be 4 to 6 that becomes more appealing, or 9 to 12 kind of thing. So we think for the individual who may or may not have to make the commitment to do it with someone else.
Right. Well, as someone who dines at restaurants by myself frequently, that makes a big difference. And I think of the bar design at Legal Harborside, and it's perfect for that in the sense that you make acquaintances.
Yeah, and that definitely goes into the design propositions we think about it.
Okay, this leads me to one other bar-centric question. I'm sorry I didn't come into this thinking that I would. I wrote a piece for Boston Magazine about 3 years ago, maybe, just a short little piece, about when the Oak Room at the Copley Square Hotel was still, before it had been, well, I'll leave it to you what I think of the renovation, but I don't think much of it. It used to be a grand, traditional piano bar room, like the only one in Boston of anything like its scale. And But nevertheless, despite this grand tradition, it had 2 flat screen TVs behind the bar, with like ESPN on one and Fox News on the other with the sound off. And I thought, is nothing sacred? And on the other hand, there's another place in Kendall Square that is called Firebrand Saints, owned by my friend Gary Strack. It's a great place. But it has like 5 flat screen TVs behind the bar. One of them shows real television. And then the other 4 are increasingly pixelated sort of abstractions of what's on the leftmost screen.
I see.
But the point is, the question is it possible, and maybe it is simply not possible, to have a bar in 2016 that does not have a flat screen TV on it?
So the short answer is no.
I think I know the answer.
But, it's interesting because when we opened up Harborside about 5 years ago now, we have 3 different floors that are all different venues. Sort of sort of more casual down below. There were TVs on that bar. The more celebratory white tablecloth on the second floor. And then the third floor, which is more of a lounge. So you would expect certainly that the first and the third floor would have a TV. We had great debates about the second floor, whether or not to add TVs or not, whether that would interfere with the food experience. And we went back and forth. And I think we ended up putting 2 small flat screens in, one on either side. So they don't detract from what you see. But if you want to watch a ball game and get the score, you could see it. Right. And I think if we were dealing with just aging boomers and seniors, the argument might have gone through that we don't need them.
Right.
But with more millennials, more focused on the digital age of what's happening information-wise. Right before the class started, there was not one eyeball that was looking up on stage. Everyone was, we all do this, looking down. So I think that's where we're getting our information, and there's a kind of addiction to it.
But the question is less about pure formality versus informality than about what you were talking about before, fostering an environment where conversation can occur. Because, of course, I remember many times when I was younger when you would, there wouldn't be a television in a bar and it wasn't expected, and you would go there and you might have something to eat and you might talk to somebody next to you, which I think is especially in our atomized digital screen-based era, it's a good thing.
Yes.
Not to sound like Martha Stewart.
No, absolutely. So that's why, well, for 2 reasons. One, that's why we generally don't have the sound on.
Right.
So that you could do that. But if you were just sort of by yourself and you want to see something, you could see, what was happening on CNN or Fox or wherever it happened to be.
So when you guys, we have this in the text for this course is, you might think would be kind of slippery since we talk about so many things, but we use a text called Change by Design by Tim Brown, the CEO of IDEO, the design firm that's based in a lot of, but based in California and in Boston. And so we talk about, how design thinkers, they empathize, they define the problem, they ideate, they prototype, and they test. Well, clearly, you empathize with your customers because you try to understand what experience they want. So you have the osteria, the test kitchen, the airport. Those are all different experiences, and I suppose really the assumed customer is different in those.
Yeah, or sometimes the thought is let's give our core customer some different experiences.
I see. Okay.
Part of it might be how do we pick up market share if they know that the quality is going to be one thing. If it has a little bit of a more formal feel or a little bit of a more casual feel or a little bit more of a sprinkling of an Italian feel to it. Let's give them sort of different experiences within the realm of what we do.
Right. So how many of you in here have been to Illegal Seafoods? Okay,
Thank you.
That's very good. How many of you have been to some of the new types downtown near Downtown Crossing? Legal Crossing?
LX, yeah.
LX?
Legal Crossing.
And how about the Oysteria? No, okay. It's interesting, by the way, the class that we're not going to have on the 17th was going to be my good friend Blake Middleton, who designed for Tony Pangaro the tower at the former Filene site. We'll have him next semester. But how do you, I mean, the influx of new residents downtown, has it reached critical mass now to make those restaurants make sense?
It is getting there. It is just about there. So the idea is, if you see, and you have to look out. I mean, I think part of our job, is any job of a business person, is sort of anticipate what people are A, going to want, and B, where they're going to want it, you know, certainly, and that's before they actually acknowledge it. Because after they acknowledge it, and then you're sort of playing catch up. Well, gee, the best location is no longer available. Now I have to be off a side street. So it becomes, I mean, there's risk in any business decision that you make. So when we look at Downtown Crossing as an example, that was an area, it's still an area to some degree in transition. But if you look at it sort of in a macro way, it's one of the centers of transportation in Boston. You have the Commons, the Garden. You know, you're not far from the North End. You're not far from the Boston Garden. You're really not far. You have access to the public transportation, take you to Fenway Park. You're walking distance to Newbury Street and Boylston Street. So that makes sense, even though it has had sort of a rough last 25 or 30 years. It makes sense, and given the investment of the Ritz and of the Millennial properties, that is going to take off. So when we look at
Winthrop Square.
Yes, absolutely. So as we take a look at that, we say, look, people are going to be here. We either get in early or we get in late. And so many times now I'm taking a look at getting in early. And so we're right across from the Opera House. Our offerings are a little bit different. It's almost like it's sort of, I think, a menu that caters a little bit to the new residents moving in. It's different enough from a legal, where if you still want a legal experience, you might go up the street to Park Square.
Right. Are you going to be involved with the Wynn Casino?
Probably not.
Just
yeah.
curious, because it seems like that seems like a kind of venue that could make sense for you. But
You know, it could. I have a friend that I've known for a long time that is now the CEO of Foxwoods, and he's been trying to get us to come out there, and you know, I look at restaurants as being sort of a fun place. You know, I don't want people that are anguished smoking cigarettes around oxygen tanks. You know, sort of.
Or people who've just accidentally lost $15,000.
That's not a fun place. I mean, yes, you can make money doing them, but I want to be in more upbeat places.
No, touche. It's a good point. I ask only because I've only been to Las Vegas twice, and I'm not a gambler at all. It's not my cup of tea, but they have some really good restaurants there.
Yes, they do. And it's a fun place to go.
It's a fun place to just go and eat a different place every day.
I agree.
Okay, all right. I want to ask you one more question, and then if the audience has some, I want to get you ready for that. So you are famous for many things, but one of them is recognizable and sometimes controversial advertising strategies. Let's discuss. Like, I mean, there was the most recent one I can think of was the sort of Hillary Clinton cold fish.
Yes.
We call it sushi thing.
Yes.
Which could have rubbed, you know, well, it's controversial.
Yes, it was what we call them provocative. But
provocative, sure.
I mean, so it's kind of an interesting point. So, first of all, I think fundamentally, if you're going to do marketing or good advertising, you really shouldn't blend. You should really sort of capture people's attention and potentially emotions. So what we try to do in our advertising is sort of hit what we call the sweet spot. And the sweet spot is you look at an ad and you sort of wonder, should I be offended or not? And if we always get a few that are and a few that aren't and think it's funny, then we know that we've succeeded. And you know, so we generally take on potentially provocative subjects. We've taken on religion, And we've had ads that...
Not the most popular subject in advertising.
Right, it's not the most right. People tend to shy away from it. And so the advertising that we decided to do, it opens up with someone with a melodious voice, speaking in almost religious undertones, and you see, beautiful mountains and sunsets, and then all of a sudden it's extolling you to convert and become a Presbyterian.
Right. Pescatarian.
So some people thought we were saying convert from being a Presbyterian, and so a lot of people over 80 did not find humor in that.
The only remaining Presbyterians being over 80, by the way. Right.
So we've had that. We've done some obituaries, ads that look like obituaries, and the older population did not think that was funny. The younger population thought it was funny. Again, as I look at our guest base, grew up watching things like South Park. And, you and I might have watched Disney's Wonderful World of Color. So the message is, if I just say, oh, our fish is good, come eat our fish, right. So everyone's eyes are going to glaze over. So I think that we have different style restaurants, and we don't mind sort of mixing it up. The ad that you alluded to was a little bit more controversial than we anticipated.
Right.
We did one on we were equal opportunity. So the ad campaign was, as a joke, I was running for president, and we took on certain issues. We took on one that said, we support the gay community. That's why we proudly serve rainbow trout. And so the majority of people actually, thought it was funny, and one of the gay lesbian magazines asked us to do advertising in that. But there was a couple of people thought that it was a homophobic thing, and it certainly wasn't the intention.
Right.
So when the RNC was opening up, we had a big ad, full-page ad of Trump, and it was like this, and the ad said, it's not the size of your hands that matter, but rather the size of your shrimp. Okay, so you thought that was funny. So, and then we did one. I said, well, look, we can't lampoon Trump without doing Hillary. So the Hillary one was, so the term cold fish was not intended to be gender specific,
right.
But some people interpreted that, and that's one that went viral and was a bit controversial.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions from the audience? All right. Well, I want to thank you, Roger, very, very much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Nice job.
We covered everything in the